Can we teach you that again? Shut over. You can't get up now. Now he
welcome everyone. Thanks again for your interest in moving this agenda forward for the Madison River, and thanks to all the interested folks from the community who dedicated their evening to joining us. You know, the commitment here to this group, the Madison River Working Group, as I said in our first meeting, is to get this right, but probably not perfect. Few things we know for sure. Montana is going to continue to grow. Things are likely to continue to get a little warmer and more challenging for our freshwater fish. And this group is really charged with kind of working out the details on what the former commission put into an ARM back in November of 2020. I wanted to recognize also Dawn Scar is joining us tonight. Dawn, I suspect this may be your last meeting with us, but you're always welcome to come back.
I say the same thing.
Dawn is in the process of retiring from the department, and he's leaving big shoes to fill. More on that. Dawn's going to make a presentation to us tonight. Let's make this a productive session tonight, and kind of the spirit again of Winston Churchill, perfection is the enemy of progress. And when Eileen and I got into the details on the agenda, we realized we had a lot of informational detail to go through this evening with Dawn's presentation and with Mike's presentation on the latest shocking results. So this is going to be more of a learning meeting, and then I'd like to circle back here in a minute and just talk about dates for our upcoming meetings. Dan Larson contacted me just a few minutes ago and said that his flight was delayed, so he will not be able to join us tonight. We have Chris McGrath on Zoom, and hopefully Christy Michelle will be joining us shortly. A few housekeeping things. One is we moved the meeting to 6 p.m. and I just want to make sure that this is a good time for everyone. For us working stiffs, I think moving any earlier might be pretty challenging. Good. Any comments? Okay. Then we'll get folks back on the road to Helena an hour earlier. Next meeting date. So the next commission meeting is on the 14th of December. And I think it could be helpful to have one more meeting between now and then, just so we kind of keep things moving. And so I just wanted to have people check their calendars real quick and see if we can find a date that'll work for folks, at least who are here.
Did you say the 14th?
Yeah, the 14th is the next commission meeting. Pardon me, of December, right. And we could also meet later in that week. It doesn't really matter. I don't think we'll be bringing any recommendations to the commission at that time. I guess I'm concerned about getting into the week of the 20th, just because of the holidays.
What about that week, the 6th through the 10th of December? Is that, Casey, what you're looking at?
I can make the 10th work. Friday, I can't. I'm going to be traveling internationally on Sim's business earlier in that week.
And I'm on a plane in Mexico on the 10th.
On the 10th, and you're gone. So maybe this pushes into January. How about the rest of you?
10th works for me. I can't do the 8th through the 11th.
8th through 11th.
That's that mass summit.
Got it.
Or Casey, you're out all that week.
It's about the week after Thanksgiving.
I am, and that's works for me. I can do the 29th or 30th.
And Casey, none of the staff will be here that week. We're all at a division meeting, so.
Okay.
You can certainly meet without us, but just so as you know, you won't have tech support or any of us.
Okay.
What about?
Mike
December-
Bias has already agreed to
What's
do
the
the check.
14th, 15th?
What about December 1st and 2nd? Is that, I mean, you were saying?
That whole week, we're
Thank you.
all out
Sorry.
at Fairmont for a division meeting.
Thank you.
You should have our meeting at there.
You can, but still, we won't be available.
What about
I'm
the
sure
week
Steve
of the
would.
13th?
I'm going that. What about next week? We always have Zoom, right? So we do it at night.
Yeah.
Zoom.
I mean,
I'm available next week.
Next week.
I mean,
I'm gone next week.
I'm gone the entire week, but
you're gone the entire week.
yeah.
We're on meet a hunting season now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, 3 of those days.
November 22nd and 23rd, right before Thanksgiving, Monday, Tuesday.
How's that feel?
That works. I can Zoom it, but I can only be here.
That's fine.
Zoom works.
The 23rd.
23rd?
23rd is Tuesday.
Let's check for the department.
When is that?
How are you feeling about the week of Thanksgiving, the 23rd?
It's the Tuesday, the 23rd before Thanksgiving.
No, sorry, I can't commit staff that week.
You're out that week?
It's the week before our division meeting and it's Thanksgiving week. It's the worst. Those are the worst 2 weeks of the 2 years for us. Sorry.
Well, I mean, look, we could still have a working session. This is what this work group's supposed to do. I mean,
Yeah,
if you
no,
feel
that's,
me-
you don't need us. We can certainly ahead of time make arrangements for the room, get the Zoom link for you. And we can distribute that ahead of time. We can, whoever's going to be running, one of you would need to bring a computer to run, or we can have someone in the region do
I'm
it.
happy to do that.
So
Would
we
we do
can
that
walk you
meeting
through
here?
this.
Here
Well, we-
or in the regional office?
And we prefer to do it in the regional office. It just depends on when you pick your date, if the regional office is available. What I'd like to do is, we are committed to recording the meeting, so whoever is running it, we can walk through how to do that. It's just, those 2 weeks are really bad for us, for committing
So you're
staff.
recording off the Zoom, right?
We're recording off of Zoom, so it's pretty easy just to set up the Zoom and then you hit the record button.
Why did that, targeting that Tuesday, the 23rd, and Eileen circulates something, and if it falls apart, then we'll know in the next couple of days, but it certainly would be nice to get a meeting prior to the end of the year.
Yes.
And I think we don't do it, then we're in January.
Okay. 23rd or 22nd? Everyone good on the 23rd?
Tuesday,
23rd.
Tuesday, the 23rd.
I
Monday.
posted
Hammer
Six-
down.
6 p.m.
Tuesday,
November,
23rd.
right before Thanksgiving, you can Zoom, come down.
6 p.m.
You can bring a turkey. I'll order a
Yeah.
turkey.
Yeah.
Smoked turkey.
Right here.
We're gonna do it in the regional office.
Oh,
I'll need to double check on that to make sure the regional office is available. So Casey is 6 p.m. on the 23rd.
Yep,
Okay,
perfect.
we'll work on getting everything set up.
Same time, or do people want to meet earlier?
I can do earlier.
Up to you guys. I'll make anything work.
I can always do it earlier, but I don't know if you can.
I can do anything. 5:30,
Makes the drive home.
5,
You may want to Zoom, right? I feel your pain, right? 5:30, 5:30 is good. Hammer down.
5:30?
Yep.
Let me, I will work on getting a location for you and the Zoom set up, and we'll get stuff there if we can, but I can't promise anything.
Thank you, Eileen.
thanks, Ed.
Appreciate it. The other one I had is, I met the new head of parks, Hope Stockwell, and we had a brief chat about the FAS dialogue that we had here, and I think there's, it could be really beneficial to have a follow-up group with those of you in the group that are most familiar with the sites, and maybe even think about a site visit with Jay Poppy. And so I'm kind of looking for probably 2 volunteers to help out with this. John, Mike, yeah, Brian.
Ryan Sue, yeah.
Yep, so what I'll do is I'll get that going with Hope here in the coming week and try to nail a date before winter really sets in. I think that would like the visit you and I did to a few sites, I think that would be really helpful. So the next topic is really a decision we need to make. Yeah.
For, at the, you know, the timeline of the public scoping for the rule changes on Madison? Is that going to be available prior to your December meeting?
For the commission meeting, you mean?
Yeah.
Do you know when that goes? It's not filed with the Secretary of State yet. It won't be,
So my
it won't be
understanding,
finished prior to the commission meeting.
we had a brief meeting on that after the commission meeting. I think that the final public comment's gonna come in on December 16th, so a couple days after the meeting.
Are you,
And then and then we're really in the hands of the department's counsel and the Secretary of State. What our hope is to have a quick emergency type commission meeting to vote on that before year end to help Eileen and her team out with the reg book.
So just so you know, the reg book is already set to go to print, and we're printing it as if the rule is passing. So if the rule passes,
a
as if you,
current rule passed?
as if
It's
the
the old
repeal
rule.
passes, so it'll be as it's written in the regulation book, which is what you all voted for. So that's how we're printing it right now,
So you're printing with no change to the regulation.
which is what you all wanted.
Correct.
For
So
now.
we are printing it the way it would look as if the rule passed,
Read just the way
which
it
is what I
does
said
now.
at the last.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good question.
Well, I figured that was, I thought it would be important. If we needed to do something prior to that commission.
Yeah. So, and again, just process-wise, the working group has one job, right? We're making recommendations to the commission. We're not really looking for lots of public comment. I don't have a big problem with live streaming these meetings, but I do, my only concern that I expressed in an email to all of you is if it's going to inhibit, open conversation during these meetings and make the meetings any less productive, then I'd be concerned about it. And the only other thing I know is, we're having enough of a time just getting folks set up with access to the web or, getting these Zoom calls set up. And I know how live streaming works. And, Zach, you're probably an expert at this, but oftentimes the folks out watching the live stream can't see PowerPoints and stuff like that. So I'm going to leave this up to the group to decide. And Mike, I know you had a few folks contact me. Maybe you can summarize your thoughts on why you feel so passionately about
Yeah,
this.
so really following the commission meeting last week and receiving the email from, or letter from George Grant to you, essentially, talking about how we're behind closed doors and secret meetings and agendas aren't released in time and then that plus, hunting season now, and I was contacted by several outfitters that are the meetings live streamed so they could look at it for lack of a better. And I thought, and then following that, we are a work group and going through the NRC. It's important for me to hear what the public had to say. For example, we had to do that guy come in and give a presentation for however long, and he's a non-member of the work group. But I just felt that all those being as transparent as we can be, take as much input. My feeling is take as much input from the public as we can to do the work so that when our recommendations go to the commission, they're informed and as solid as they can be, and that we're doing the work on behalf of the commission. So, as they get it.
I just hit pause there. I'd say that the commission's still required to get public input both
Absolutely.
at the commission meetings and during the public input.
Right, but if we hear it prior to them, then
Right,
We can provide solutions and incorporate it into our recommendations.
right.
That's
My 2 cents is that if there's even a perception that we're having closed door meetings out there, then people fear the unknown. And I'd imagine it's not anybody's intent to do anything secretive or that isn't transparent. And so just being transparent is the best cure to that. Things are often in government a lot more boring than people assume them to be. And if you demystify a lot of the anxiety and fear, you just have an open book. That's my 2 cents.
We were accused of that, of having closed door meetings, secret meetings with the NRC. I think it's better to avoid that situation.
I thought we should take that out of the equation and have the live streaming. And, but also knowing that this process is different from the process that took place when Mike was one of the 3 folks that were leading the charge and did such a great job. And we heard so much from the public during those meetings. And this is a new process. And this process is 12 of us sitting around a table and listening to the economic impact, listening to our county commissioners, listening to outfitters, listening to Foam and Moga, and all of us listening, learning, evolving, sharing, and that is a process in and of itself. That we've heard a lot from the public. The commissioners can hear from the public after we present something to them. But I think it's important to identify what our process is right now as a working group.
Yeah.
And that doesn't have anything to do with not. I think we should have live stream.
I don't have any problem at all, of course, with live streaming. And what I don't want, first of all, I'm not particularly sensitive to somebody throwing a grenade at us, accusing us of closed door meetings. In fact, that has exactly the opposite effect on me. So I just have very little tolerance for that type of criticism. But live streaming it sounds perfectly fine to me, good to go. I don't want it to become such a laborious process thing that if something on our agenda isn't published 2 weeks in advance, we can't talk about it or something. I don't want the handcuffs on this. I want a conversation, that we can learn from each other and take forward and do what we were charged to do without the constraints of, it's going to be published 2 weeks in advance and it's off the thing, therefore we can't. No, that's the commission. We're a work group, and we should be allowed to be fluid here and move in the directions we need to be. But live stream the heck out of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Well said.
Yeah, everyone consensus on this one?
Yeah.
Eileen, I'm gonna need some help from the department on what happens if we say we're gonna live stream and for some reason we can't, or we have a meeting, or we have a technical problem. So maybe we talk to Becky about that.
Well, so legally, what Becky will tell you is we're not required to provide public access to the meeting because no decisions are getting made. It is our standard. It's our standard just to try to do 2 weeks public notice and then involve the public as much as we can, just in general with any of our meetings. I think there would just be general perception issues if you advertise it as it's going to be live streamed and something happens. I think the more important question for you to talk about is if you would allow the public who are on Zoom to participate, provide public comment, like you have done for people attending in person. I think that's probably an important thing for you to talk about because the public are used to, if we provide an open forum publicly, the public are used to providing public comment. So I think that's an important thing for you to talk about.
Okay. I mean,
Question, does that raise
Try the
any
first
kind of
one.
technical challenges for us?
Well, it's always a technical challenge. We
Yeah.
can do it. It would just be the same as we do most of our rules hearings that way now. Our commission meeting is obviously done that way. Our parks board meeting is done that way. We can do it. the bigger challenge is having staff monitoring to make sure we're getting people heard.
Yeah, let's hit the pause button there. How about, back to your point, Mike, is it okay if people just observe the meetings?
Yeah,
and not-
yeah, it wasn't my intent to have them call in and provide public comment.
Yeah, I think we give a great forum for that at the commission hearing,
Right.
so.
And I think the key to that, I'm totally good with that. I think the key is just being really clear with expectations at every meeting, and just repeat that. Probably use chair just saying, this is what kind of meeting this is, we welcome public observation and want you to be informed, but this isn't a public meeting, this is
That's easy, we can do that, how we would do that, just so you know how that would look. So we would broadcast on YouTube. So just like if you're not participating in the commission meeting, you can go onto our YouTube channel and watch it live. So it would look like the Zoom, but it's just like watching with no, and what we would do is make that clear in the press release. It'll
Okay,
be Zoomed with no virtual public comment. So we can do it that way if that's your preference.
all right,
And
great.
simply add until it goes to the commission, which is the normal public hearing process.
Yeah, we have standard language that we put in of the purpose of the committee as a work group, yeah.
Okay, well, one of the topics we're gonna get into tonight, which I don't think we have time for, is this, and several of you, Brian did a nice job on thinking through some topics and circulating an email on capacities for both rec and outfitter use on the river. And I would propose that at our next meeting, we get into that, if everyone's good with that.
I would propose that Brian presents the document that summarizes all the options at the next meeting.
That's great. That'd be a good start. You good with that, Brian?
I am.
Okay.
And I would add, if anybody, after reviewing that, has additional ideas, the idea of that document was to start a conversation, so feel free to share those.
Brian, quick question, would you like us to share those documents on the webpage? I believe they're up on Teams already.
Sure.
You want us to put them on the public webpage?
If you haven't had a chance to look at the detail on that, please do between now and the 23rd. So the charges of this group, I think we're all familiar with this, but the group this is a 3-year commitment. So we're gonna actually see these recommendations through, assuming the commission adopts them. The work group's charged with developing recommendations to the commission regarding the allocation of commercial use trips to outfitters, a process to permit new outfitters on the Madison River, which is, I think, an interesting topic that we really haven't, developed much in the information that I've seen today. And then rule language to address all recreational use on the Madison River, including walkway sections and rest rotation proposals to replace those in ARMS, which we've already addressed that part of it. And then consequences for permit violations. So in addition to that, we took a look at fishing access sites and potential recommendations to the department for improvement there, with the idea of facilitating easier access to the river. And I hope that sometime in early 2022, we get back into the topic of making some recommendations on fishing regulations with the help of latest data and biologists. So any questions about the ARM rule or charges or dialogue on that? So the,
Casey, just a comment if I could.
you bet.
So we get an article put out in the Bozeman Chronicle. It's fairly critical of some of the things that have gone on. It's completely misplaced. Unfortunately, it was like written 2 years ago or something. I'm wondering how we can more effectively communicate our charge so that people understand we're charged to do some things that we haven't even done before, and that's look at public use and lay that groundwork in advance in going to the total transparency thing, so people know what our charge is supposed to be. That set us back.
I agree.
It's kind of unfortunate, but it really set us back. So just a question, I guess, what capacity do we have? How do we get the charge? Maybe if we're gonna stream this thing, maybe the placeholder for the log-on thing is the charge of the committee or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. So that is not a surprise to someone. That maybe, how do I get around that kind of an argument?
Are you talking about the editorial board column?
Yeah. Unfortunately.
How do all of you feel like we should respond to that? Do you think this work group should formulate a response? No.
I don't know.
I think we're going back to like maybe we're gonna stream it, public notice of what our purpose is. I just don't think we need to engage in that.
I called my home and talked to him. He was literally out of touch. He reviewed the article we had written, and he was based on a 2-year-old.
Well, ed board op-eds are written by a group of citizens that meet with constituents, so you could ask for a meeting with the ed board or write a response, or just maybe an op-ed that was pretty, just to say, we spread the concerns and here's what our charge is, and we welcome public input along the way, and here's how to do that, and here's what our scope is, or something like that.
And that's the response. But I don't want to get in a fight with that device. It's eaten by the barrel either.
Any other comments about, Brian gave me a copy of it this afternoon. I have not read the op-ed piece yet, but I hear it's not great.
I think
So the website we post documents on, we could also have a lead statement of what the charge of the group is.
Sure, of course. I think it's already on there,
I don't,
just not,
the
They didn't look
website.
at the website.
Yeah, no, the website has a description of the charge, it has the rules, it has a description of what the committee is doing. There's a lot of things that get written in the newspapers that's not accurate.
Really?
In my experience. So everything on good is accurate.
okay, so I'd like to move into into Don Scar's presentation. Oh, sorry, Mike Duncan, you're up first.
Yeah, Kim should pull it up. Kim, will you pull up Mike's presentation?
That's one of these deals.
Yes, I am working on that right this second.
A boy, a girl,
Before you
right here, and a
Are you able to see that okay?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mike Duncan, the Madison Gallatin management biologist. I took over for Dave Mosher about a year and a half ago. So I was asked to provide our latest, greatest data from the Madison. Just so you're aware, this is somewhat brief and preliminary, as most of you all know. We sampled the Madison, at least the upper Madison, in September for a couple of weeks. It takes a couple weeks to get those data entered. I was in Oregon doing some microchemistry work actually for the Madison for the latter part of the month. Hiked my gun around the mountains last week chasing elk. So we haven't had a lot of time to dig through these. You mentioned getting into angling regulations in early part of 2022. I feel like at that point, I'd have a little better understanding of where we're at with the data from this year. If you guys have questions leading up to it, I can do some specific analyses of the data if there's questions as far as size, structure, abundances of certain groups, that kind of thing. And can provide some answers then.
Like that'd be perfect.
Yeah. But this will give you a kind of general idea where things are at, some more thorough stuff than we did last year, kind of set the stage for maybe some future talks. Kim, am I in control here? Is she?
Kim's in control.
Okay. If you guys need to get a hold of me, here's my contact information. I've got some cards I can hand out at the break too, but you can head to the next slide, Kim. And go ahead and advance it again. Again. And again. So as you're probably aware, we have 3 long-term sampling reaches on the Madison. Or upstream most is Pine Butte, which is upstream of the West Fork. Varney starts at Varney Bridge downstream towards Ennis, and the Norris Reach starts at the Warm Springs FAS and essentially ends at Cherry Creek. Norris gets sampled in the spring whenever we get water temperatures above about 40 degrees. Varney and Pine Butte are typically in September. And the way these work, like most of our other long-term reaches, we have a marking run where we go out and sample these sections. On the Madison, we make 3 marking runs. We take a fin clip, usually a pelvic fin, so we can come back and identify the fish we captured during those runs, during our recapture runs. So we'll make 3 mark runs, 3 consecutive days, release the fish, come back a short period later, sample the same area in the same way, and identify which fish we captured the first time around, and that allows us, essentially the proportion of fish we capture allows us to come up with a population estimate. We ran into some issues this year. As everybody knows, we were pretty warm throughout this part of the world, and our abundance estimates weren't the greatest. When you start approaching 60 degrees when you're electro fishing, your catch efficiencies go way down. And so the one thing we struggle with on the Madison is waiting long enough to where we have good cool water temperatures. It's not going to injure the fish, but it does decrease our catch efficiency. But if we wait too long, we push up against spawning for browns, and those fish are moving all over the place, and then you run into issues with your abundance estimates then, and then just juggling the schedule. It creates an inconvenience for a lot of the commercial folks and general public being able to schedule around us, and we try to coordinate that and give folks a heads up so they can work around us when they're out fishing. So our estimates weren't great this year. You're going to see some giant error bars, especially for the brown trout. So keep that in the back of your head as you're looking at these numbers. I'm not super confident in some of them for the upper reach this year. Everybody got a good handle on where we're at with this. Kim, you can go ahead to the next slide. So this is total trout, and I wanted to kind of summarize what I'm considering the fishery. When we mark and capture everything, we focus all our efforts on 6-inch or greater fish, because when they get smaller than that, we're just not good at catching them. So 6-inch and greater. But when I think of the fishery, when someone's going out to fish, most folks aren't interested on the Madison catching a 10-inch fish. So this just kind of summarizes 10-inch and greater fish, both, well, we have 3 now showing up the Madison, but rainbows and browns combined. In Pine Butte, there was an upward trend the last 20 years or so. We're seeing a slight downward trend the last few years for combined trout over 10 inches. Again, I'll have error bars on these when we split them up by species here in a minute. But the last 3 years, we've seen a decline from a relatively high number in 2019. Kim, you can advance it. This is Barney. You can kind of see the cyclical nature we have down there. We've actually been trending up the last 4 years. And interestingly enough, there's some neat things going on with rainbow trout that I think are driving that trend, especially the last 2 years. And then you can advance it again. And Norris, our lower reach, you know, it's kind of bouncing around there for a while. The last couple of years haven't been great down in Norris. Relatively low for both species, especially so for browns. Any questions? We can kind of take questions as we go, or I can wait till the end, whatever folks want to do.
I mean, Mike.
Yeah.
I get that the point estimates show some potential trends or something. But
Yeah.
We're going to see them in confidence interval.
Yep. Yeah, the next slide's up when we split them up by species. It's a little tough to combine them.
Yeah, gotcha.
Kim, you can advance to the next slide. So this is messy. I'll tease this out by section, but this shows brown trout abundances for each section on top, rainbows on the bottom, starting upstream at Pine Butte, Barney, and Norris. And you can see our error bars here. And Kim, if you'll advance to the next slide. So this is Pine Butte. Browns on the left, rainbows on the right. And this is 6 inches or greater. So this gives us a little better idea of biologically what's going on with the population and not necessarily focused on fishery. So relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the river, for both browns and rainbows, things seem to be pretty stable. There's, you know, cycling through, and you can look at when we have water, we typically get fish. You think back to 2011, great, better than most people probably wanted for runoff year. Following years, we had pretty good recruitment and high abundances. But you see, it's pretty typical what we expect in a lot of these populations to see some cyclical nature. Again, the error bars, these are 95% confidence intervals. So we would expect the data to be somewhere within there 95% of the time. You can see this year, our brown trout estimate is not useless to compare with past years, but it's tough to really gain a lot of confidence when you've got an error bar that high. And again, we had really high water temperatures that dragged into September. So unseasonably warm in the low 60s. We tried to start early in the day to help combat that, but it was a struggle that we're gonna work with some of our other staff this winter and try to find ways where we can shrink those error bars and get a little better confidence with those estimates.
How will you do that?
We can revisit when we sample. You know, if folks are a little more willing to be flexible with when we sample, and we can kind of wait till what the river lets us do, rather than here's our schedule for September, and this is when we're going to be out. Be a little more flexible there. Reevaluate if we're concerned about browns in the Madison, is fall the best time to be sampling them when they're moving? Maybe shifting to spring, but then you run into spawning with rainbows. So it's just a balance. You know, there's limited time, limited capacity for everybody. Just reevaluating why we're going out when we're doing it. Our current approach is to have one crew go out on those marking runs for 3 days. Maybe I can get 2 more crews to come out. We knock it out in 1 day. We can shrink up our window between mark and recaptures, and that allows us to minimize fish moving out in and out of the reach. That'll tighten things up. So there's a variety of ways you can shrink those error bars, gain a little confidence, minimize the inconvenience on folks fishing, and get a better idea of what's going on. I think we just need to sit down and really think about why we're doing what we're doing. This kind of data set doesn't exist anywhere else. I mean, we have decades, half a century of data on the Madison. So you need to really sit down and think what we're potentially walking away from when we change things up. But at the same time, could we be improving it by kind of modifying how we're going about things? But all in all, compared to the rest of the river and other rivers, things seem to be holding fairly steady. We've got a downward trend with rainbows the last few years, but we've seen similar things happen in the past. So it's not, who's not to say that things could bounce right back in the next couple years. Kim, you can advance. So this is a little messy. This is size structure. We're looking at 1-inch length groups in each bin. So this would be 6-inch fish, 7-inch fish, 8-inch fish, length distribution. And what you would expect to see are very high abundances on the left of your smaller fish. And then as they die for whatever reason, you start to see fewer and fewer of them as you trickle down to 20-inch fish, you know, that are 3, 4, 5, 10 years old, however old they may be, fewer and fewer through time. On the far left, you have an average of 2000 to 2010, 2011 to 2020, and then 2019 and 2020. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to do this with this year's data. Kim, you can advance it again.
That all trout.
These are all browns, just browns. Yep, so everything from here on out split between browns and rainbows. Just to kind of give you a perspective, 10-inch fish and 20-inch fish, this is consistent throughout the rest of the presentation. Not a whole lot going on here relative to what we're going to see. You do see fewer fish just in general the last few years relative to what we see, but the distribution in lengths is fairly similar to what it was in the past. That'll be very clear that that's not the case in other reaches. You can advance it again. Same thing for rainbows. What you typically expect, that high distribution on the left and a slow tapering off as you approach 20 inches. We don't get many, 20+ inch fish in our sampling, mid-20s, like we do with the browns. Kim, you can advance. As we move down the Varney, this is where we start to see some interesting things going on. Browns have been fairly stable the last few years. And then the last two, we've had extremely high abundances of rainbows. And that's primarily been driven by small fish. Kim, you can advance. The interesting thing here, if you think back to the previous slide, there wasn't as much of a discrepancy between these smaller fish and these age 3 fish. And so we're not getting the recruitment here that we're seeing upriver. There's a much smaller proportion as you move from these smaller fish over to the right. And back in the day, I used back in the day a little bit too much, but 20 years ago, we used to see, not a lot, but it was common to see fish in the mid-20s, even a little bit bigger than we're seeing now. We're not picking them up nearly as often as we were in the past. So that will become a common theme as we continue to move downstream. Mortality in those older age fish has increased through time, so we're not seeing nearly as many of those as we used to. Kim, you can advance.
Like same thing this year when you were sampling.
Yes, we did see a couple really large fish. A couple of the guys said they saw some bigger fish than they've ever seen on the river, but in general, similar trend, I think, to what we've seen in the past. You can advance again. And again. Similar situation with rainbows, except that I think it's even more evidence here. A ton of younger fish. And this graph is similar in 2021, this year, as it was last year. But we don't see these fish, this hump, moving over here. For some reason, they're either going somewhere else or they're dying. We're just not seeing what you would expect on that last figure where you had this second hump of H3 fish. And Varney, it's an interesting stretch of river. You've got the ice gorging, you've got a bunch of spring streams down there. potential to move up and around. So there's an interesting dynamic going on here. But this is what's driving the population abundances right now, these small fish. We want to try to figure out how we can turn these small fish into bigger fish. But that's the big question here, is that we're not getting that size structure as we are further up in Pine View. You can go ahead and advance. Again. And now we're down at Norris. Browns aren't looking good. That's been a slow slide for the last 20 years. This was our lowest abundance estimate in the last 20 plus years, probably on record. Rainbows were actually increasing, relatively low, but we've seen those numbers in the past. But browns and the size structure you're getting ready to see are pretty concerning. And it's not indicative of a healthy population. You can advance again. The one interesting thing is that I believe this year was the first year we caught enough cutthroat to come up with a population estimate. So if everyone's aware, Cherry Creek was a big reintroduction effort about 10 or 15 years ago. They've occupied the stream up there, and we're starting to spill out into the lower Madison. And so we had a population estimate of about 100 cutthroat per mile down there. I've gotten quite a few phone calls from anglers who are catching them, and a lot of nice sized fish. So that was a nice win, so to speak, this spring, that we're seeing a lot of those. You can advance again. So this is what has me worried. Again, 2000, 2010, 2011, 2020, and then this year. We're not seeing many small browns, and we're not seeing many big browns. Very truncated length distribution, low abundances.
So just a question, when I'm
Yep.
looking at that histogram, are those representative of the population sample across size classes, or was it just your sample size? Is that just a sample size?
So those are the fish we captured.
So this is just.
This is not an abundance estimate. I don't like doing the link frequency histograms with the abundance estimates, because it can get super squirrely out here with bigger fish and abundance estimates, just because you're catching so few of them and you often don't recapture them, and you can get a wildly.
So these aren't weighted by abundance.
No, this is what we captured, and so it's you could use it as a surrogate. So I came from Virginia, and very few rivers do they complete abundance estimates like we do. They use catch per some unit, and it's usually a link. And so you're using abundance as what you capture as a surrogate for some natural abundance.
Yeah, I'm just saying that.
Yep.
I think you've answered my question.
Okay, all right. You can advance again, and we see similar things with rainbows. Again, probably again, until the green comes up. One more time. Same thing, very truncated length distribution. We're not seeing the long tail like we used to. I think it's fairly obvious what's going on down there. We're pushing 80 degrees even on a good year when we're pulsing. Northwestern is helping with pulsing flows. We're pushing the bounds of what cold water fish can withstand. So you've got really high water temperatures, potentially limiting spawning habitat. And there's a handful of trips, Cherry Creek, Hot Springs, that comes out of Norris. Gets a few fish up there in Elk Creek. We do have that microchemistry work I was doing. We can talk about it outside if you want. I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but I was essentially last month looking at fish movements in the Madison and where they were spawned, and we're seeing fish coming up from the Jeff and the Missouri and lower down. So we're getting a contribution from there, but spawning habitat may be a potential limiting factor down there. It's just, I think it's a rough reach for fish to make a living for a variety of reasons.
Mike, what's your opinion about the heavy track traffic of inner tubers down there, walking down the river, et cetera?
I don't, yeah, it's,
Just an opinion.
There was a.
I think I gotta steer clear of that one. I hate to punt, but, yeah. it's-
Negative impact or no impact, or who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. Sorry. Kim, you can advance. Again, I think we're on the tail end of things. You can keep going. Yep. So yeah, like I said, very preliminary. We've been working with Tim Klein at the with the USGS to look at our brown trout trends statewide. And
We've lost the volume and everything on Zoom.
About like this, when he wants to go out.
I just sent a message to Eileen to let her know.
Thanks, Kim. Sounds like
Yep.
you've got your hands full like me do.
Yes, very much so.
recruitment from tributaries and some of the bigger boost. Been trying to take a bigger swing at Madison. So a really interesting point for us in Madison with that work and some agent growth work we're doing with some help from MSU. I think we'll have our toolbox full and be able to, I think, really identify what's limiting things on Madison and how we can improve an already great fishery. So, but again, I'm sorry I don't have any more data than that. But if you guys have specific questions for meetings later in the year or next year, just a couple days notice, I can come with specific answers if you need. Yep.
Like our big issue here is, the capacity of the river and, are we at a point where the number of anglers, both outfitted trips and recreational users, are impacting the fish health? Do you have a point of view on that, one way or the other?
So again, this winter, I think the age and growth work and the mortality estimates we're going to develop with Chris Guy at MSU will really help us understand what mortality looks like among age classes in the river, whether it's sustainable, where we can improve things, whether it's, in Barney, how can we increase recruitment of those age 1 and 2 fish to get us some larger fish down the road. It's really tough to tease apart angling mortality from natural mortality without doing specific studies, because everything's so different in the Madison. Like I mentioned, down low, you've got potentially fish getting churned up by ice gorging around Ennis. Some of those fish, I think with Pat's work, he saw that they dove down into the reservoir, probably sought some refuge there. Just very different dynamics. And to explicitly come up with some sort of angling mortality, you can do the back of the napkin calculation, this many based on creel surveys, this many fish were captured, use some estimate of angling mortality from the literature, but even those numbers vary so much. How confident are you that they apply to the Madison, let alone specific reaches in the Madison? And so it's really tough to do it. You can try, and I think if you're way one side or the other of what's sustainable, we could probably figure it out. But if you're close, even remotely close, it's going to be tough.
How about a hook scarring?
So we do have hook scarring data. They've been collecting that as long as I know. And that's one thing I want to do this winter. I haven't seen a report where they've summarized that. I gotta quit saying they, it's we now. That we've summarized this. But we do have those data. Again, that's somewhat subjective. We do a good job checking the fish, but we might miss this,
So is that a frequency of hook scarring?
Yes,
or is
it's
that
just
tied to
frequency, it's
a
not-
condition factor?
No, well, you could. So we note whether a fish has a hook scar.
Yep.
And so I can, track that through time, what percentage of the population has a hook scar.
Right.
I can look at condition differences between of growth or condition at the time between a fish with a hook scar and one with not, length, weight, all that stuff. Yep.
Yeah, we did that and it was pretty telling.
Yep.
It was work that I think is worthy if we're gonna be concerned. It seemed like the anglers have a threshold where hook scars become an issue for them.
Right.
It's 50%, I'm just throwing that out, or lower, nobody cares, and 70% they do.
Yep.
And so the question then become, is that more esoteric or is it actually something significant
Right.
to the condition of the fish? I gotta tell you, in my career, I would have loved to have had this kind of data.
Yeah.
And this is a beautiful set of data, and what you just presented to us is a basis for understanding what sort of a range of acceptable thresholds would be for a population to rattle around in. And I was actually very impressed with the precision on the brown trout estimates in particular.
Yeah, for most years, it's actually pretty good. You would think in the
Other than
fall
those
that,
2
yeah.
years,
Yep.
it's kind of weird, but that's pretty solid stuff, man. That's good work.
And so I'm reluctant to walk away from how we approach it, but I think we can tweak things to get around what we ran into this year and tighten those intervals up.
Do we
even
do
more.
anything with length frequency distributions on the catchable population?
Mhm.
The fish that are being caught?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
so that's an important overlay.
Mhm.
Yep. Okay.
Mike, help me with something. First of all, thanks for all your hard work. It's really helpful what you this data. Help me with something being an outfitter. It's a somewhat of a controversial practice, the electroshock sensing. Not sure if you got pushback from that in the outfitting community. But let me just kind of tell you what sort of I hear. And it's more emotional than it is based on knowledge, right? So, shocking, belly up comes the fish, and this is what the outfitters care so much about, is how they make their living, they nurture them. So help me, what can I tell the brothers and sisters in the outfitting community about electroshock therapy? I hear things like, there used to be a hell of a salmon fly hatch from Barney to town, which there was in the 90s, clouds of them, and now it's much less than it used to be. That's a fact. So did this electroshock kill the nymphs? I hear these conspiracy theories. So also, these fish are full of eggs and getting ready to do their deal. Help me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the salmon flight thing, that's driven by temperature. They have a very narrow window as far as temperature tolerances go, and we see that salmon fly hatch creeping upstream more and more. As far as mortality injuries go, this has been studied pretty thoroughly. I put together, I think when this came up this fall, a little literature review for Eileen in our director's office, and I'm happy to share that with the group. And when we do our job, we sample at the right time, using the right conditions on the shocking unit. We don't kill fish. Well, let me take that back. We kill a few fish. It's not many, and certainly not even close to enough to have population level effects. And I don't think anyone can question that. We do kill fish, but it's very few, and we do what we can to minimize that with using pulse rates and the type of electrical currents that have been identified to minimize injury and mortality. The literature's there. I can share that with you. That's why we struggle with the window, trying not to push up against spawning, because one, we don't want to disrupt spawning fish. just for the sake of leaving them to do their thing. But again, we're walking a very thin line when we're doing these abundance estimates, because we're assuming what's called a closed population, that those fish that we sample don't leave and fish don't enter between when we're sampling. And when we push back farther in the fall and those browns are starting to move more and more, we're losing fish that we tagged and we're gaining fish that weren't tagged. And so that's throwing off our estimates. So we're trying to juggle water temperatures and spawning, and you run into that to some extent in the spring with rainbows, but not nearly as much. But the literature is there to show that when done correctly, this doesn't result in population effects.
All right, well, that'll help me
Yeah, and
answer some of these
I can
questions. The
share
salmon fly one helps a lot.
John, what might be useful for you to know too, and I think I shared this with Commissioner Walsh when this question came up previously. All of our staff are required to go through what we call electrofishing training, and it's mandatory for anyone doing this. So it's not just done on the Madison. We did statewide.
I would never question the staff. I'm just answering to pressure in the outfitting community about the technique.
So the two things that might be useful to help answer those questions is, part of that training is safety, obviously, but the other half of it is for our staff to know the ideal conditions for shocking in, to, number one, avoid causing damage to the populations, and secondly, to get the most accurate population estimates. So the staff routinely go through that training. There's a policy that they're all required to follow. So I think it's worthwhile sharing that information, that it's not, because it can be a little alarming to see the floating fish. So it's worth letting people know that the staff are doing everything they can to minimize any impact to the population.
Certainly not questioning the staff at all. Thank you, Eileen. That's helpful. And then just a final question that might also help in sort of maybe goodwill to this practice. Have there been policy changes that have been made, regulations that have been made because of data that has come from electroshock censusing over the past 30 years, 20 years?
I've been around for a year and a half.
I can answer
I'll
that.
defer.
And if so specifically, if you know of anything.
This data that Mike showed is, really similar, consistent with what we get from all of our biologists statewide. And we actually have what we call a repeatable reporting tool. So those graphs that Mike showed are the same graphs that every biologist uses for their river.
How about on the Madison River? Has there been a policy or regulation change that's come because of this?
Yeah, so I'm getting there. So all of our management, regardless of the location, is influenced by that data. So when there is a population change that concerns a department, we will make a recommendation to the commission. But the decision on a regulation change happens at the commission level. Pat, do you know, you were
looking for a specific example of a regulation.
Pat, do you know of a specific example on
Every
Madison?
brown trout reg we just implemented based on electrofishing.
Well, yeah, all of
The maximum of a limit of 5?
No.
This
These enclosures.
Yeah.
Well, that's up on the big hole. Yeah.
That was
We've
more
made
than-
regulation changes throughout the history, going back to the 1970s. And it was all prescribed by the population dynamic. So for many years, when harvest was actually part of the equation, we would change different limits to protect a spawning. For example, if the juvenile fish weren't showing up, and it was because there was over harvest of the large fish, we would have what we might call a slot limit or a top limit. But when harvest dwindled away to the background levels, we would open it up to harvest, and then anytime you'd see a signature of harvest causing a problem, you take that out. But when harvest was out, you'd manage based on, maximizing opportunity.
Okay, that's helpful.
And so,
Thank you.
I mean, we had slot limits in Madison. We used different reaches where Snowball below Pine Butte had a different regulation, so you could test overwinter mortality between the two. So it's an iterative process, has always been driven in Montana, and especially in Madison, by population dynamics.
Okay,
John, I
thank you.
offer an observation though too, and that's having the benefit of this kind of data may not always be defined by addressing a conservation concern. You may maintain fishing opportunity in the face of what else would you have?
Well, that was
Some
nice to
public
see those brown
perception.
trout.
Well, some
Levels
public,
rising.
I mean, historically, we all know how fisheries go. I want to be the only one there, the fish are smaller, and I'm not catching as many as I used to. That's what they always say, right?
Right.
Well, this data here is a basis on which to maintain fishing opportunity.
Agreed.
It's as important for that as it is to define what our conservation problem is.
Thank you. Yeah. Good.
And I will say one thing too, as far as defending the practice, we do take conditions and what's gone on months prior. We didn't hit temperature criteria in a lot of spots on the Madison or flow. It was for hoot owls this year, but the East Gallatin was in the 80s, and in the lower it was 85. I don't know that I could have gotten a boat down there even if I wanted to, but I was hesitant to get back out there this fall and sample the East Gallatin with the summer that those fish had.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
the right way that's great. And so, I mean, Mike Bias will tell you, I mean, there was a particular guy who was super hot this last year, Mike Field, one of his calls, and there's a couple other calls. So this is just really nothing more than hearing it, talking about it, and letting me get some answers back to these guys that get super hot.
Yep.
Thank you.
And call me.
No, I
think you were.
Mike, I have just a question in general about, and the reason, I guess the background for the question is, as Casey spoke to earlier, our job as an advisory board is to deal with, the increasing use on the river and the increasing fishing in the river. And as we all know, although there is harvestable allowed through regulation, the majority culturally now is catch and release fishing. And there's been lots of studies on, well, what happens when you catch a trout and release it? And certain percentage of those fish, die from the strain of the fight or how they're handled. And so, reading some of those documents on some of those studies, as you know, the rate of mortality after being captured, temperature is a big driver. If they get caught when it's warm and 70, they're less likely to survive. So certainly there's a fair amount of fish being killed from catch and release angling pressure. Is that fairly accurate?
I don't know that I would feel comfortable saying a lot. I might at some point, but I'm not now.
Right.
Fish are dying from catch and release.
From catch and release.
You can't deny that. Whether it's a lot and whether it is resulting in population level effects or changes in size structure, I'm not comfortable saying yes or no, probably until this spring at the earliest when we're done with some of the work this winter with MSU.
But you will be able to take a better stab at that.
I think I'll be more willing to speculate at that point. I'm not even close to that at this point.
Well, and it goes without saying that prosecuting a recreational fishery is going to have an impact of some kind. It's not neutral.
Yeah.
It's not neutral. But what he's got here is historic data that tells us whether we're operating within historical norms. I mean, there's no argument that it's, consumptive fishery. I think that's a disease.
Well, and I'm also trying to understand, looking at the Barney data where we're producing lots of small fish. So the populations are actually increasing in number, but we have a lot of small fish. The size distribution has changed recently. Is that because, is it possible, I know we don't know the answer to this, but if we're catching more and more and more fish, and some of those fish are dying, that it gets harder and harder for a fish to get old. And so you're producing lots of young fish every year, but it gets harder for them to age.
Yep.
And if they're getting caught enough times sooner or later, some of them don't make it. Is that possible? Do you see places where you have harvest? I mean, are there other populations of fish where fishing pressure, whether it's catch release fishing pressure or catch and harvest fishing pressure, influences the size structure?
Yes.
Of the
So
fish?
it's tough with trout because generally folks don't eat trout. We're fortunate just over the hill for this example, but not life in general, with Yellowstone lake trout. Chris Guy and his colleagues have been working with Park Service to hammer lake trout by gill netting, and you can see a shift in the size structure and abundances because of harvest. So that's a good example that we've got close by and someone to work with this winter. So you can see, generally you see a size structure shift before you see a shift in the overall abundance, because those little fish coming behind can make it to the point where they spawn and maintain those abundances, but you're losing those bigger fish that you used to. You still might have similar abundances, but you've lost one end of that link frequency histogram. So there are examples, especially in commercial fisheries, saltwater fisheries, that that's clearly outlined. Yellowstone Lake's a great example that we've got right next door. Some really good data.
And so a follow-up question, in my mind, I hope whatever we can come up with here, put some safeguards in place that will protect recreation quality and protect the fishery for 20 years out, 50 years out, 100 years out. So the microbiology data that you're working on will give a better indication of.
So that microchemistry looks at movement. We're using, we got two otoliths coming from the fish. I used one for the movement stuff. The other one is looking at growth through time and how old that fish is. And then we can start to develop mortality estimates for each age class and whether that's sustainable. Identify specific parts of the population where, in Barney, we got really low recruitment of age 1 and 2 fish. Whereas, maybe those larger fish we're seeing, they're 4 years old and they're gone. Whereas in other rivers or other periods, we were seeing older fish stick around, but they're just not given the opportunity for whatever reason to make it past 4 or 5 years old.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any of that type of data for whitefish?
No, not on the Madison. Historically there was some whitefish sampling done. I think primarily in Snowball, the whitefish reach. There was a grad student actually, Jan Boyer, who worked with Chris Guy. She was at MSU when I was finishing up, and she did her work on the Madison with whitefish and fish. And so she's got some good age and growth data, but we don't have the long-term whitefish continuous data set that we do for rainbows and browns. But there are some data out there that we could use.
Well, you're sampling, why wouldn't you just collect some whitefish data as well?
There's a lot out there. We struggle. We have to make so many stops as it is, and so within that 4 mile reach, we have 8 or 9 sub stops. We stop at the same spot every year, which allows us to do some neat stuff. We're looking at the habitat characteristics, number of boulders in one of those little sub stops, so it allows us to kind of pin down on a really narrow reach. And it's great that we've been doing it for decades. But we already have enough rainbows and browns to deal with. If you start putting whitefish in the live car, you have a lot of dead fish, or we're stopping every 100 yards. So it's tough. So we try to do a few things really well and not half-ass a lot of things. I think there is some interest in whitefish, just general declines that we're seeing. And so we've got Jan's data, and maybe we revisit Snowball every couple of years if that's of interest in folks. So we could make it happen, but we can't do it while we're doing rainbows and browns.
Are they a useful indicator for temperature? Because they're a little more sensitive than trout, right?
Yeah, I mean, they have their own issues going on, you know, in the Yellowstone, what we saw in the lower Madison this year with it wasn't PKD, but probably that was the primary cause for the fish kill. But there's some other drivers there, some secondary stressors that kick in because of water temperature, and they could be a good indicator. Yeah.
I think kind of tagging on to Brian, I think one of the things that keeps coming up for us as a working committee is we're looking at the impact of humans, right? Of the human impact on the fishery. And I feel like what I hear you saying is it's not really something necessarily that you measure. It's like once you see the fish population change, then we're going to start to see, does this number of people or how they recreate change that? It just doesn't seem like there's an answer. We keep wanting that answer as a working group and in the past, and that never really gets answered, and maybe the answer is we can't.
That's fair. It's tough. I don't want to say you can't. And to Brian's point, I want to be proactive. I don't want to wait for things to get bad with, if it is angling or whatever else, to address it after the fact. And so that's why I'm trying to get through some things this winter to get ahead of whatever issues might be coming down the pipeline and setting ourselves up as best we can. So I'll feel more comfortable with the human side of things in the near future. I'm just not ready to do it now, but it is something I'm interested, but it's one of the more difficult ones to answer.
And what do you look at to get that?
You can look at mortality estimates, and then we can correlate angling pressure, use data from creel surveys, the number of fish captured, what the literature says about hooking mortality, and come up with some estimates of what angling may or may not be doing. Again, it's dirty because we're using data from other rivers, and you know those estimates vary. Even a couple percentages is pretty substantial. So it's rough.
With is Ogilvy, is that the right?
Ogilvy. Yep.
And so that research that you're working on, that, well, correct me if I'm wrong, right now we can measure fish and see how old they are, right now, or how long they are, but we don't know how old they are.
We do to some degree. So I can't remember if Pat, you did some. I know Dick Vincent did back in the day using scales.
Right.
So we can use scales. It doesn't kill the fish, but it's easy to age a fish with the scale up to about 3-4 years old. But once you get a really old fish, I can tell it's 8-10-ish years old, but I don't have a whole lot of confidence. Like I know looking at a scale, I know that's a 2-year-old. I know that's a 3-year-old. I know this fish is really old, but I'm not really confident. Otoliths are much more reliable, and so that's why we're using those. And so when you look back at scale data, a lot of times it just says 4+. So we don't have the resolution with some of the scale data, but we can use those data. I would feel comfortable using old scale data for age 2, 3, 4 and see how that stuff is shifted through time. If you're interested in what how old a 20-inch fish was 20 years ago compared to now, I'd be a little more reluctant to go down that path. But the bulk of our fish are 2, 3, 4 years old, and that's what's driving the abundances. So we have a little more leeway there.
Mike, so can you give us a guesstimate as to when you think you'll have the work done this spring? We'd love to get you back here and have another meeting with you.
So that age and growth stuff, we've got Chris Guy, hopefully has one of his grad students starting up on the initial prep. I'm hoping to get it done by April, by the time we get going with field work again, at least the preliminary results. And we have fish in the Madison from each one of the long-term sampling reaches. I have rainbows and browns. We have fish from the reservoirs, Ennis, Hebgen. We collected some from Valley Garden. We have browns from the Big Hole. We have browns from the Beaverhead. I think there's rainbows and browns potentially from Missouri and some from the Bighorn. So it's going to be neat to see how we're also going to have the ability to kind of compare among rivers too, which will help out a lot. But for my side of things, probably April is the earliest it's going to happen because we've got hundreds of otoliths to section, polish, and read, and so it's pretty labor intensive, and I'm relying on some folks from MSU to help out with that. So.
And you think you'll be able to get the magnitude of the error?
What's that?
You think you'll be able to narrow down that error?
Oh, the error on the abundances is just limited to how we sample. So that's a matter of sitting down with folks and seeing if we can get 2 extra crews out there and maybe sample a little more efficiently. And then next year, if it's still 60 degrees September 9th when we go out to sample, let's wait 2 weeks and let it get down a little bit, even if it is an inconvenience. But that's more sampling. So that's wait till next year and do things a little better.
Could do it right during salmon fly, John.
Popular.
Stir things up. Mike, thanks so much. Any other questions?
No, this is great. Yeah, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and if things come up, if you guys have specific questions about data, I'm more than happy to help answer, provide literature. I met with Brian and we chatted through some things, whether it's providing figures, actual data, or reference to some studies. I'm happy to provide whatever you guys need.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
John, are you gonna hang around too?
Yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit. Might check
We're gonna take a little break right now.
the police scanner to make sure my kids haven't burned down the house
Yeah,
yet. I'll stick around for 15 or 20.
Thank you very much.
Why don't we take like 8 to 10 minute break and regroup?
Great.
I don't know if all that music is coming from the Madison Gallup TU meeting.
I don't want to talk about
I know, it's like I want to, it's like you kind of start. I know, you kind of start.
Will do.
So, user surveys on the river were actually one of the rules that we have before us. The rule is worded kind of a little bit confusing, partly because originally we were talking about having mandatory reporting by river users. After we really got down to it, thinking about that, that was a pretty impractical thing to do and would cost a lot of money. So what we chose to do is, having mandatory reporting by all users of what they're doing. That would actually amount to a census. Well, we don't need a census to really actually make useful decisions on recreational use on the river. So we ended up just deciding to do surveys instead of selected people on the river. What we got started this year, partly because as the rules originally stood and still do until they're changed here shortly, presumably, is that we were going to have walk weight and rest rotation go into effect this next year. So we wanted to make sure we got some surveys of use on the river, patterns of use before those changes went into effect. And also just as baseline information for this work group to consider going forward. So I just wanted to describe and show some of the preliminary results of what we got. I think going forward, the work group can provide really useful advice to us on how we might conduct future surveys. Anticipation isn't that this is the kind of thing that will happen necessarily every year. Might only even be necessary to do comprehensive surveys every 5 years or
certainly less than yearly. But before I go into what we did this year and some of the results, want to distinguish what we did this year from what's gone on in the past. I mean, there's been some discussion here of the 2016 surveys that were done on the river by FWP, the Creel surveys. Those were actually solicitations of opinions by people, not just on the river, but users they got addresses for. The scoping survey that we did 2 years ago in advance of the environmental assessment. Some of you participated in that, where we got 8,000 responses. That was an open Survey Monkey type survey where anyone could chime in on what they did. What we did here this year was went out on the river. I had 2 student interns that worked, one on the upper river, one on the lower river. They're actually going out and just talking to users. So some of those previous surveys included people that weren't actually using the river at the time, but they were expressing their opinion of what they thought should be going on the river. This is just current river users in this current survey. The other thing that I won't present here is what we did this year was we just went to 23 formally developed access sites and asked people what they were doing and their opinion, their satisfaction of crowding at the site and on the river. And I'll show some of those data. What I'm not showing here that we also did is we actually put 7 cameras on the river to try to actually get a census of river use, actual people on the river. And those data that's going to be a while before we get those summarized.
What do you think, Don, on that, time-wise?
Oh, geez, middle of next year?
Yeah, I mean, at best, if you want to compare it to the commercial use, it's going to be no earlier than April of next year. And that's assuming somebody goes through and watches all that footage. So.
Yeah, we've got like 300 gigabytes of video to look through.
We've started that, Don, though,
We
right?
did start it. Yeah, we are on it already. What we did was we had our 2 student interns go to these 23 sites on both the upper and lower river, conducting interviews. They were conducting interviews of everyone they encountered, but in terms of questions related to crowding and satisfaction, they only proceeded to get responses from people who had actually finished their activity for the day or were in the middle of it. If people were just getting started for the day, they asked them a few cursory questions, demographic type questions, as well as a question about how they felt about crowding at that site. But there were no questions about what their experience was on the water itself. So we ran from May 25th to September 29th. It was intentionally trying to make sure we got Memorial Day and Labor Day in there. We did what's called a stratified random sampling design, and I'll show you how that looked. But basically, we were trying to not be prejudgmental about where people were going to be or what their opinions might be at a particular site or a particular time of day. So we were spreading out our effort at all sites, at all times of day, both weekdays and weekends. And I'll show you how that looked in reality. Again, everyone was asked about their activities and crowding at the site they were at. Only people that were finished or engaged in their activity were asked about their experience on the river itself. And for those sections that people were on where there were already existing regulations, restrictions in place, or ones that were proposed through the rules. We asked questions about how they felt about that as well. I think it's worth mentioning where I say this complementary to Northwest Energy surveys. Every 5 years, they do surveys on the river throughout the whole. They don't go to all 23 sites, but they do a comprehensive survey in the Madison, Missouri corridor every 5 years, where they actually ask people at the sites their opinion of facilities and whether they're meeting their expectations. So that's good information that we intentionally did not collect because we knew Northwest Energy was doing that, but it's complementary to what we're doing. And as you get into it, that's something you might even consider asking them to come give a presentation about their information.
Don, is that the Missouri Madison River Fund?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Kim, could you scroll down a little bit? Oh, no, first, still the summary, but the page, couldn't see the lower end of the page. There we go. So, and another thing I won't present here, but just to mention that we also did it, we did try to actually, every time we surveyed certain areas where there's a lot of dispersed wade fishing, we actually tried to do a census of actual number of anglers that were out there when we did the survey in those 3 areas. So go ahead, Kim, to table 1. And you scroll, yeah, great. This may be a little hard for you to, can you zoom in a little bit, Kim?
It's been a lot.
Okay. So this shows on both the, I've got the uppers on the lower here, the lowers on the upper, but I've got the whole time period where we did the surveys broken into 2-week periods and then by hourly interval. And so this just shows the number of, I guess, shifts that the surveyors did at the different times of day within the 2-week intervals. And so this is part of what the stratified random design is designed to do, is to try to spread out effort evenly and not be presumptuous about what our answers are going to be. So trying to spread it out randomly. The way the shifts work, they either started at 7, 9, or 11 a.m. and then worked an 8-hour. We're on the water, or not on the water, we're at the sites for 8 hours. So it ended up being the actual time when they were at sites tended to be grouped more toward the midday than the morning or the night when it's all said and done. Okay, Kim, go to, I guess it'd be 3 and 4. Okay, now that's a little big. Perfect. Okay, now here I showed you the shifts by each of the access sites. Yeah, that's probably good within those same 2-week intervals. And this is just trying to show you, we tried to even the effort out by all the access sites. And for the most part, they were pretty close. Had probably a little bit better even effort on the upper river than the lower river. And so, okay, Kim, go to, let's see, was it 5? Yeah. Demographics, and maybe scroll, yeah, there you go. Great. Demographics of where people were from. people have read the 2016 Creel survey. They did demographics as well. These are actually very similar to what they found 5 years ago. Upper River, 26.8% of people that were interviewed were Montanans, mostly non-residents on the Upper River. I think everyone's pretty much aware of that. Lower River, almost the opposite. 66.1% of people there were Montanans. California was the primary other state for both the Upper and Lower River, or the one with the most people showing up. And in terms of the counties, Gallatin, Madison, not surprisingly, were the two most common. We did get, I think, 48 states interviewed. I think Rhode Island and Delaware are the only two slacker states that didn't show up, but I'm sure they were there. But
how about international?
Well, no, not this year, because of the COVID restrictions.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it would have been interesting to see what that would have looked like.
When you sample the lower river, are you doing tubers as well as fishermen?
Yeah, yeah.
Don, there's
You'll enjoy some of that.
surprisingly few residents of Silverbow County there, I see.
I was thinking that too. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's the first county I looked at.
Yeah, that's.
Do they fish down there?
Not anymore.
No?
You should write a lot of letters.
Yeah, that's true. On a less controversial matter, if you'd scroll down a little bit on this same page, Kim. Keep going. Yeah, so that's good, Kim. For some reason, Pennsylvania was a lot of Pennsylvanians. I mean, they're much more greater than their population, almost as many as Texans. So, okay, Kim, what are we on next? Table 6, there we go. Okay, and this, maybe you could blow this one up. Yeah, this is kind of busy, but everyone who is on the river, we asked, where are you launching? Where did you launch? Where did you take out? So we'll have a full characterization of where, at every site where people were going to. And on the Upper River, where a lot of you are familiar, a lot of this is not too surprising. You know, Lions Bridge, mainly Palisades was the main destination, but Windy Point, Ruby Creek got a lot of use. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all these, but this will be in the final report, is this distribution of where everyone was coming from and going to on the river. Lower River, not terribly surprising. See the huge number there. I mean, 80 or 90% of the traffic on the entire Lower River was between Warm Springs and Black's Ford. It's just the tuber alley there. Also of very much interest, I also put on here is the percent guided, percent of floaters that were guided. And that's in this column right here. See Lions Bridge, we had 64% of the floaters were guided. Highest percentage actually was down here at Ruby Creek, 79%. Could you scroll down, Kim? I guess stored ditch was, okay, that's great, thank you.
And the numbers in parentheses, that's the number of survey respondents.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not necessarily the reflection of how many floaters there were. I mean,
It is indirectly.
right.
I mean, well, only a reflection of the days when we were there. Yeah, I mean, so it's a pretty loose idea of, you know, the relative numbers of people at different sites, but you know, some of these surveys just happen to be at busy sites at busy times and others not. So it wasn't, we weren't surveying for that purpose to try to actually get an accurate comparison of use at each site. There's car counters out on the river kind of for that purpose. That's what we would rely on for actual numerical differences between sites and uses, those car counters.
Don, if you had somewhat even dispersion of samples based on sites because it was stratified random, you would have no indication of abundance based on responses.
Well, if you randomly were so lucky as to be totally random and equitable between all sites, then you would. But as I was saying, we weren't in reality. We're just doing too few samples to, so, you know, so yeah, you know, these numbers shouldn't be used for that purpose. The main reason I put them there is that's our sample size, and it probably also important is these numbers like down here. I mean, that's too few to really say anything very, I guess.
Right, but the proportion between those you talk to and the amount that were guided is robust.
Well, if you look at the way the shifts were structured though, you gotta be
That's a
careful
good point.
because in the evenings, if you ever launch in the evening, it's almost 100% not guided.
Right.
And there was fewer sampling opportunities in the evening than there were midday.
Yeah.
So rather than do the late shift, almost all of the late morning, early afternoon was captured with a much higher sampling opportunity.
So Don, on that last line that's in it, is that saying 10 people were sampled? 3 were going to Valley Garden, 3 to Klutz, and 4 people didn't know where they were going?
Hey, you know, we just write down what they tell us. I think often it's someone who's guided, who, I mean, they know where they are at the moment. They may have not known where they put in or where they're going to take out. So that's usually what don't know means. And I mean, there were don't knows
in all of them, yeah.
In all of them, yeah. For the most part, people knew what they were doing, where they were.
That was to tell the shuttle driver where to put your car.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, when our surveyors are out there, half the time, roughly, they're encountering someone that's just putting on the river. So really not able to get a lot of useful information out of them. You know, and maybe that was a flaw with our survey. I mean, I kind of wanted to be able to make some generalizations about different types of use at different sites, which is why we structured it the way we did this year. But, you know, if we wanted to get more information on people's experiences on the water, we'd probably do more of our surveys later in the day than we did. So we got a lot of morning before people had that experience yet. What are we up to, Kim? I guess go to the next one, whatever the number is. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, everyone, yep, great. scroll down just a, there you go, perfect. So we also asked people what they were doing, what they were there for. And what I have here is, let's see, yeah, just this is just a tally of the number who indicated they were doing one thing or the other. I've highlighted the biggest one in yellow here, not a majority, but just the one that had the highest number. And so, yeah, we were asking all these categories here of what people were doing. The non-fishing float trip was typically a paddle boarder, a kayaker, you know, a rafter. And so, not terribly surprised. This is the lower river here, obviously, not terribly surprising. The tubing was huge, and even as far down here as High Bank got some use, but mainly just down to Black Sport. And could you scroll down a little bit, Kim?
More fresh.
There you go.
When this kind of started right around Memorial Day, when did it end, the survey period?
So,
End of September.
End of September.
well, Lower River was earlier because of that. That intern had to go back to school. So September 12th was her last day.
So fishing's probably underrepresented.
Yeah.
Because fishing at the lower happens mostly early and very late.
Yep, yep, I think that's right. More of the, down here at the lower end, that's where you get some more of that non-angling use on the river there showed up. Okay, Kim, go to the next table, please. So this, whoops. There you go. So here's the upper river. Not surprisingly, in the walk wade section, you got private wade fishing is the primary thing. You'd have some guided wade trips, and then a few boats we captured in that section. And then here we get into your major guided boat fishing section. Seemed like in this section we were typically running around a third of, or 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio between guided and private boats there in that section, at least in the surveys we had here.
Can you adjust, because you have less, can you proportionally adjust these based on the schedules of the surveyors' shifts? If you had a much higher number of shifts in midday portions, right? So can you sort of equalize by hour, right? Adjust per shift, per hour. Because right now it's not truly random sample across all hours of the day, right?
Yeah, we
make
can't,
sense?
that's right. We can't characterize it that way, in other words.
Right, because non-guided use is actually a higher percentage that's being displayed because you're not capturing as much of the the evening crowd as all night guided, basically.
Yeah, sample size is kind of limited to do that kind of analysis, but we could look at that on, maybe if we grouped it all together, we could look at hourly intervals and see how that changes. If that was desired, I could look at some of that. I mean, that would probably be a desirable thing to.
Right, like when you have the camera data, right, you're counting every hour of the day. And so it's
But that's not we have no idea if those are guided or.
We don't, but we can compare that to SRP data for floaters. We can subtract out SRP one, we know who floated where and what.
But not by hour, SRP data. Is it?
No, but if you're trying to report a daily percentage of guided fishermen, but you have less sampling data in the evening and more during the day, right? Guided fishing is usually done by 4:30. So if you have the majority of your sampling sessions in that time of the day, whereas private fishing happens spread out across, there's people watching at Lions Bridge at 7 o'clock at night, at 6 o'clock at night, and 8 o'clock at night, on a July night. And if you're not capturing that, if you have someone sampling there, or if you have someone sampling there but much fewer sessions, then the distribution represented is, that the actual proportion represented is not this skewed.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, as I write this up, I can take a look at that and see if we can maybe, to the extent possible, say something useful in that regard.
You might still be able to extract it, right? You might be able to normalize it based on the number of sampling sessions and the different time zones.
Again, sample size is gonna be kind of
right.
Our enemy here. Yeah, it's pretty low.
Don, in the camera data, you cannot discern guide boats from non-guide boats.
I don't think we can we, Andrew?
You cannot discern
So
with any amount of certainty.
In the NRC, when we did one camera in 2017 or whatever it was, and you told everybody we can't discern guide from non-guide boats, why did you put out 7 cameras if you still can't gather that number?
Because it's a math equation with what we're doing. So,
but you're using SRP data minus camera data to come up with
camera data minus SRP.
Yeah.
Non-guided.
Right.
Which is
well, but it's a simple math problem though. It's basically we know how many boats went by a camera on a particular day, and we know how many boats were reported by outfitters on a given day that went through that section. So we subtract that number from the total number, which leaves us presumably assuming that the reports are accurate.
Well, it's good. It's good that we have that information for Madison. We have cameras, traps on Yellowstone, and you don't have the SRP data.
Right, and then you would never know.
And Fish, Wildlife Parks and others are still putting cameras out there on all these rivers and not being able to tell guided from non-guided. So at some point, let's get a camera that can pick out the guide sticker.
See, it's not that simple. When you zoom in, you have to have a wide enough angle to capture all the boats going down. But then the
Camera data
pixelization.
is not very, not the kind of data we should be looking at. Right? If you put one camera out in 2017, you can't get guide or non-guide. Why do you put 7 more out?
But again, it's discerned from that equation. We know how many boats went through that section, total boats, and we know how many outfitters reported a specific number of boats through that section on that day. We subtract that number from the total, and that gives us at least a very, very, very close number to and assuming that the reports are correct.
We're lucky we have the reporting on the Madison.
Well, I mean, we did it because we do have that information. So that was what contributed to why we chose to do it this way. Also keep in mind, I mean, the camera data it's designed to give overall indications of crowding, and we're hoping it's trend data. It'll start trend
Overall
data.
indication of use.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're trying to get at, Mike, too, is that overall use, not just the commercial use.
In the questions on the surveys, did you mention crowding? So again, you're baiting the people. Hey, how crowded was it out there? If you're coming from New Jersey, man, it's not crowded. But as soon as you ask them how crowded it was, they start thinking maybe it was crowded.
Well, how else do you find out how crowded it is unless you ask people?
Well, exactly.
How you phrase it.
What's your perception of the amount of use out there, or?
Okay, well, we'll get to that here. You can see the question we asked and
So
give me some
I'm just
feedback.
starting to get, we went over this with the 2016 CREO surveys and the 2018 survey, and it's the same questions all the time, using the same biased sampling or questions, and, thinking you're gonna come up with a different result.
Well, why is it biased? Why is it biased to ask someone
Is it
how they?
crowded?
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, here's where we're at, Mike. As a committee member, you can listen to this stuff, and it's up to you to put weight on it. You decide whether it's gonna influence your decision heavily, or like, we don't need to debate the department about your sampling methods. You're just gonna make a decision. Oh, it's okay. I mean, that's what you want us to do, right?
I would point out on some of the really rich data sets that are like the BLM car count data, those are very powerful. And camera data would be as well with enough years in terms of use trends, right? So for like a decade, there's been, I know they're not cameras, but they're automatic counters at access sites. And so
Actually,
they're
more
pretty,
like the last 25 years.
so they're pretty, it's kind of very useful to see, well, there was a 10% increase or a 30% increase in 2020, and some of them there was an 80% increase. And that's a giant data set. Presumably when you're at McAtee Bridge, you're not going there to park to hike. Right. Pretty much 100% of the users at McAtee Bridge are there to watch a boat or maybe wade fish a little bit, but they're there to recreate on the river. And so that's rich data in understanding the change. The most valuable, the change from year to year. Was there 10% growth and every single car coming in and out? Was there 50% growth? And that might be valuable when we're trying to work backwards, work forwards, looking at how those changes happen from year to year and the trends.
I agree.
Guys, just with an eye on the time, let's keep rolling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Next table, Kim. Okay, this is getting to some of that stuff Mike doesn't like here. This is the question we asked everyone that we encountered, because everyone was at a site, so we wanted their opinion of what conditions were like at each site. How acceptable is the number of people, that's the P, people in their vehicles at the access site today. And so I provided average scores here. We've got another way of presenting it that visually is a little easier, and that's, I didn't have time to do that on this, but basically a score of 5 means very acceptable. People had no problem with vehicles at this and number of people at the site. Very high scores on all these here on the upper river. Lowest one was, Lions Bridge, or no, Ruby. Ruby was a little lower, but very high scores overall. These 1s and 2s would represent the number of people who, were unhappy, thought it was unacceptable, the people and vehicles at the site. Very low numbers. I guess I was a little surprised at that, but we had generally overall a lot of feeling of acceptability for the numbers that we saw at the site. And again, I'm trying to establish some baseline information that'll go into trend data. We do this on some regular basis. We'll get an idea how people are feeling over time. Okay, in the interest of time, Kim, move along. Table 10. Okay, Same thing we did on the lower river here. Interestingly, general average score higher on the lower river than upper river. I think it may reflect the fact that a lot of people on the lower river are happy to see lots of other people. In fact, tie up your two to mine and you'll get even happier. So, anyway, yeah, I was planning for the final report to try to break some of this out by type of user as well. Okay, go ahead, Kim, to next. Okay, so this is where we get into this. So this was the questions that were asked of people that had already recreated for the day. And so these are the questions that were actually asked of them. These are kind of busy, and obviously we don't have time to go through this, but just to give you an idea of how we're going to present it. And here's the different sections that we broke it down to. We had 5 sections on the upper river. So some of these were combining different access sites. They were in the same section, and so they got asked the same questions about their experiences. So quake to lions, they were asked 4 questions. How acceptable was the number of boats you observed? How acceptable was the number of weight anglers you observed? How crowded did you feel? And then how effective do you feel the rule was in creating a positive experience? And that rule is the one that we're going to go back to here, presumably, you know, the existing ban on fishing from a boat. Just in the interest of time, I'll just go over these 2 and then we'll move on to the lower river. But interpreting these, the white represents a score of 3, which means is a neutral feeling about that question. The red represents a negative feeling about that question, and the green, you know, a positive feeling about it. So,
but on the last one,
what's the bottom? I'm sorry, go ahead.
It says, so it'd be just flipped. It was,
yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah, in reality, the red, it probably should be a green if you're,
right,
because it's uncrowded. So I think for the report, I'll flip them so it's, you know, visually it conveys the same message. But generally, I only did it that way because the 1 to 5 scale was flipped from the other 2 questions. Generally, pretty high sense of not being crowded in these 2 sections, although you did have a certain number felt the opposite way. Number of boats and weight anglers on these 2 sections, very high level apparently of acceptability from people we interviewed. So plan was to portray the results in all 5 sections this way. The other sections being Palisades to Ennis Lake, and then the Madison River down to the dam were the 5 sections on the upper river. Lower river was a bear trap to Black's Ford to Great Cliff, and then Great Cliff to Headwaters. So Kim, if you could go to the.
Don, a question,
Yeah.
a comment. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the value of that level of geographic stratification and producing the results that way could lead you to say, okay, those 3 sections are essentially the same, so we can address the issues there. They're the same issue. I mean, why else would we break them out into such tight geographic distributions?
The reason it was done that way was just because of the restrictions in place.
Okay, so you can evaluate the quality. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, that was.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Helpful. Thank you.
No, go to the next table. Um, yeah, yeah, there we go. And I think go up, scroll up. A little more. Oh, overshot it just a tad. Okay, that's great. Yeah, so here's the two upper sections on the lower river. I'd say pretty much similar pattern, although I would say the general acceptability levels were higher on the lower river than they were the upper river, which different kinds of users down there. Can't say about the densities of people, although probably higher here, particularly in this section right here. Nonetheless, the acceptability of boats and weight anglers was very high. I think that was just my cursory view of the data suggested that the tubers really didn't care. The little slivers of unhappy people there, I think, were paddle boarders and anglers. But I'll try to flesh that out as I can in the report. Just one, that's pretty much it. Appreciate some of the comments I've gotten. I'll try to factor some of that into the report. Plan to get that done before I,
Thank you.
wait sayonara. So
Don,
that's,
just to clarify, the third question is, red's
good.
Red's good.
red is good. It's only because I had the 1 to 5 scale was the opposite of what it was for the others, but
What's the red mean?
They felt it was not crowded,
not crowded.
because they voted a 1, like they weren't.
So even on the upper river, all those third numbers were not crowded?
Yes. Yeah.
The art there would be looking at the white and the light green,
It seems a lot different than the data you had before. It was showing a lot of dissatisfaction with crowding, especially at the access sites. Then the access sites get a 4.4, 4.5.
It does look different.
So does that mean like the people that were dissatisfied don't come anymore?
Well, I think
a total possibility.
Yeah.
They go fishing in the lake.
I think one of the reasons is probably because it was, those were different pools of people that were being surveyed. Those were people that were just free to, in the case of the scoping survey, people could just sign in and express their opinion. They weren't necessarily on site in the
They were
20s.
self-selected, right?
Yeah.
They were all self-selected. Yeah, this is wicked crowded.
And kind of same thing with the 2016
These
Creel
are-
survey. Not to discount those people's opinion, but, and I don't think I'd presume to make any judgments about that, but these are all users at the day.
So there would be a thing called avidity bias, which would be applied to this, because people are on the river, they must think it's reasonably okay. People that really hated the river from past experience wouldn't be on there.
Right.
So it's kind of in this, it's called avidity bias.
Yeah.
They're avoiding it, so whatever. We just got a snapshot of how it looks this year. Thanks.
Yeah, and that was one of the conclusions of the 2016 Creel survey, was that.
I mean, that's
people
what, that would explain the difference between two different sampling techniques. You see what I mean?
Any other questions?
I was just making an observation since I was up there also.
Yeah, sure.
You seem to be way down due to the smoke in the area. And I just wondered how much that would.
In the which?
Smoke.
Smoke. It was really smoky on the
Oh.
Madison most days this year in the summer. So I think that might have impacted this survey.
And that's the value of our cameras. We'll actually have, you know, some density use levels that'll go along with this. And so maybe that would, you know, in the future, show itself comparing the two.
Didn't bother the Californians.
No.
That's where the fires were at.
Yeah. They're gonna go out regardless.
Kim has put all of these on the Teams page so that
Oh, great.
everyone can see them.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if she'll get them up by tonight, but
Oh,
they might be. I don't
I
know if
didn't
she's
see
got
them,
them
I
up
think.
yet.
But Don, you're still fine tuning, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, what you've seen is, for the most part, what I'm gonna put in the report,
Right.
along with, you know, the narrative explaining what we did and
I think it
everything.
would be helpful to flip that last one.
Yeah, that's my plan, is to, you know, turn the,
Green is good.
yeah, turn the red to green on this.
Any other questions for Don?
No, thank you, Don.
thank you. And when is your date?
December 31st.
Right.
Don, congratulations.
There you go.
Okay, I'll work till midnight on 31st if I have to.
You
get this
probably
report
don't
done.
remember.
And then that's it.
The
That's
short
not what you
term,
told me.
the short time that I worked with you, you were one of the most innovative guys in restoration work around. And I know you've moved up the ladder and on to other things, but the work you were doing while I was there was pretty amazing. And you're just an amazing guy. There was no obstacle. We're just gonna get this done somehow. It was amazing.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Hey, Don, thanks for all your great work.
Congratulations, Don.
How many meetings have you been to in your career talking about the Madison River?
We spoke about that on the drive down.
A few more than I'd like.
Well, they've got the music all tuned up for you. Andrew, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready. Now that Dom's got it all warmed up for me.
So Commissioner Walsh asked me to present some of the report data that we have from 2019 and 2020. And I already went through some of this without PowerPoint, or the majority of it without a PowerPoint. And so at your, whatever you want, I can go through that whole PowerPoint again, or just skip to the
meaty stuff.
The meaty stuff, yeah. So let's do the meaty stuff. So Kim, if you can get that PowerPoint going and skip to slide 5, I think that'd be a great place to start. So again, just in a nutshell, how we got to this place, we have a nearly complete record of all the Madison use, commercial use, through the SRP logs. It's a mandatory reporting process. And so just to start off, in 2019, we had a total of 216 outfitter permits, 6 non-outfitter permits. And in 2019, we had 225 outfitter permits and 5 non-outfitter permits. So let's skip to the next one. This is this next slide. This is interesting, and this is something that you touched on in that email that you wanted to see was used by top outfitters. And this table pretty much encapsulates that. We have in the second to the left column there, the total number of active permittees. There's a bit of errata in there. 230 should actually be 201. When I entered this year's stuff, 29, the no use or failed to report, I did not subtract that out of the total number of permittees. So the total active permittees, those that actually used at least one day on the river, it's 201 outfitters or other river-based permittee. And so it's broken down into bins. You can see how many trips, how many outfitters or other river users had X number of trips. So you can see in 2019, 18, and 17, there was one outfitter each year that had more than 1,000 trips. And then on the other end of the spectrum, anywhere from 24 to 1, that's 108, 120, 105. So you can see that there's a lot of outfitters or river users at the far right end of that spectrum with very little use or no use. In fact, the median number of trips on the river in any given year is less than 24. So most outfitters, most permit holders are using a very limited number of days. The majority of the use is coming from a few larger outfitters.
Andrew?
Yes.
This is, touched on this since you started gathering this data. I remember. And just a quick addition, 170 outfitters, 2020, 170 of the 201 did 100 trips or less.
Yes.
I think that's
impressive. Yeah, it's very important. Yeah.
Thing to understand that over well, it's 85% of all the outfitters are doing 100 days.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I said. Yeah, the median number is.
I know. I remember.
24. Yeah. I mean, this is really impressive.
We were on Beaverhead when you first did your report. I said, what's the median? 22 trips it was.
Yeah. Yeah, and that trend is, that's continued. That's consistent through the years. The number changes, but that trend is consistent, that the majority of users out there not using very many days or trips.
Andrew, excuse me, like, how does that compare, like, in percentage ratio to, let's say, the Big Hole or the Beaverhead or other rivers that you oversee?
Well, it's tough to compare it to the Big Hole or the Beaverhead because there's allocated days. So outfitters are limited to a certain number of days. So you can't really compare it to that because it's not, free will, however much you want to use. And we don't have any of this data for the Jefferson. So this is, we have the Madison.
But you guys are acting like that's surprising, and it might be, but I don't.
I guess
trying to understand what you guys.
No, it's surprising in that 85% of the outfitters are doing 100 trips or less a year. The Big Hole and Beaverhead is fundamentally different because their allocated days are 2 months out of the year.
Sure.
Which kind of skews things. I looked at the same data. I got all the data from you on PH2.
Yeah.
And when you plot this as a land frequency graph, it's really skewed on that.
Mm-hmm.
On the Big Hole, it's flat. Most outfitters are all about the same number of days. There's a few outfitters with few days and a few outfitters with huge days, but it's more flat than this one.
Right.
The other thing too, I did up to 2019. I didn't have 2020 at the time, but those percentages, like 1 to 24, well, it's up there. As a percentage of outfitters, those number of days, so at 85%, 100 or less is maintained year to year to year to year. It's flat, and I think it's really telling.
And there's fundamental differences, like BH2 permits can only consolidate.
Right.
And so over time, on the Madison for what is it, $100, you get an SRP. So there's guys in Sheridan, Wyoming that have Madison SRPs. There's guys in Missoula. There's people from Helena. And so there's a lot of outfitters that are multiple valleys away that for $100, we have a Blackfoot River SRP. And we reported one use. We did one trip on the Blackfoot. And because for $90, why not get the SRP and, use it one day? Well, just if you wanted to take a guy that used to work in Missoula and knows it and was up in that area and took some fishing. So it is fundamentally different. You have to understand that a lot of these outfitters that are doing 10 Trip Summit, they might be a very established outfitter, but they might be in Livingston.
Oh, I know.
Or they might-
I
or they
went
might
through
be in
that as
Howard.
well. It's
Right.
a lot of those 1 to 24 outfitters are either out of area, like Twin Bridges, or they're a small outfitter and then it's working for another outfitter.
But the majority of those small use outfitters are out of area, and not as much the Big Old Beaverhead, right? Because there's
That's correct. There's
everybody at Big Old Beaverhead. I mean, there's very few outfitters outside that are.
Yep.
And because it's hard.
How many? Give us an idea. How many outfitters are there over in the Big Old Beaver? Much smaller number.
64.
Yeah, it keeps shrinking and
It's
shrinking and
91.
shrinking.
How many did it start?
In 2011, when I took over, there was 103, or 106, excuse me. And now there's 91. This year was 91.
Right. It's not that dramatic. No. I mean, I would expect to see, maybe I'm wrong, but I would expect if you cap this, you're gonna see consolidation.
Depends on how you
Small
cap
guys,
it.
small guys will start selling their days.
On the Madison, with the new rule change, you don't have to completely buy another business. So an outfitter now on the Madison will be able to transfer out 5 days to another outfitter and still keep their license. So we're on the Big Old Beaverhead, that's not the case. You have to completely, so if you have an existing permit and you acquire another business, those 2 permits consolidate and those allocated trips are joined together. So there's the only thing that can happen on BH2 is consolidation. You don't have a choice. There's not the ability for a small outfitter to get an RUP and then get a partial chunk.
There's the other major difference between the two is on Beaverhead and Big Hole, it's you're permitted on those months and you don't have to use every one of those days. You might have a permit for 900 days and only outfit 130. But in the database, it still says I have 900 days. On the Madison, when you turn the records in, those are the total number of days I did in the entire year. And so, like if you were to get BH2 data for this, you'd have a trip amount or a permit amount. It's 100, and that outfitter, because of shoulder seasons, could have done 300 days or whatever, do more than
That aren't
than
tracked.
they're allotted.
The shoulders aren't tracked.
They're tracked, but they don't count. They don't count to their total number of days
On the
they have
Beaverhead,
allocated. on the
You're
Beaverhead
counting,
table.
this is year round.
This is year round, yes, this is year round.
So, I mean, what my takeaway on this thing is there's just different business models. There's some guys that are localized and central and they tend to utilize the river heavily. There are guys that are driving all over the state, having a good time. So what more is there than that comparison?
Right.
Okay.
Okay, Kim, are we done with this? Anybody have more questions? All right. Skip forward 2 more button pushes. Okay, just to recap real quickly. Oh, that was 3 button pushes. There we go. This is just the trip totals, total number of days that could be allocated based on 2019. Total is 13,947, 13,153 for 2020. And if you took the max of per outfitter or each outfitter of the 2 years, the maximum total trips would be 16,173. So we've seen that.
Thank you for doing that.
Yes.
That was a lot of work, wasn't it?
It took a long time to go through that, yeah, because it was auditing every single report that was submitted by every outfitter. Any questions about this?
And that's the 16% over 19.
Okay, so onward to the next slide, please, Kim.
But just one quick question, and it's more anecdotal for the outfitters here. Let's flip back, Kim. Well, let's say 16,000 days. What's the estimate on what 21's number is going to be for outfitter trips? Higher than 16,000. What, I mean, throw a dart.
20% over 19. That'd be my guess.
20%?
Over 920.
40.
Overnight.
My guess.
Wow.
Oh, we gotta get a pool going.
40%.
I don't have any feel for
But,
it
but
because
much
we-
higher, but much
You don't
higher for
have
not
them
guided.
Because you won't see any data.
We have got, I think, 4 reports so far from outfitters, so it's, and that's why I say it's gonna take till April to process all this, because we have to digitize all that data.
And right, the only way we're gonna get it the non-guided is through the
Camera data, but again, because of the resolution we have through that SRP data, we can say very closely on any given day how many reported commercial book, how many commercial books went through a section. So
There's another rich data source in terms of just trend, which is the BLM car count data. And that we already have for 20. So in the upper Madison Valley, there was a 61% increase in vehicle counts. And the lower, it was 76%. So you got to remember that guided use in this pandemic burst of demand was limited by our ability to service that demand. We only have so many guides. We only have so many rooms and hotels and lodges.
Right.
What is the hunting? Sorry, I'm not. Does that
So-
mean you floated and guided it?
Yeah, so it's, there's one outfitter that uses the river to gain access to waterfowl hunting.
Okay.
And so that is, any commercial use falls under the CRP. So if you're using the river commercially, even just to access, hunting on private land, then you have to report that and pay the 3% fee. And so those are the hunting trips.
Is that one outfitter?
One outfitter,
Okay.
yes.
Just curious.
What about non-angling?
So sometimes there's scenic trips, people just, even outfitters will take, guys down the river, bird watching, looking at the mountains, who knows? But yeah, scenic floating, yes. And then of course, there's also the non-outfitters on there, and those are, we have, a couple kayak businesses and scenic river tours. So.
Great, thanks.
Okay. You're welcome. Yeah, so the next question that you had for me, if you want to move to the next slide, please, Kim, was touching on peak season, shoulder season use, and you asked about some specific dates. So the first table I threw in, and this is almost on par with Don's now that I look at it, but you can see the lion's share of the use is occurring in that, June, July, August, September timeframe. And these data go back to 2008. And I've summed this up a little bit better based on your questions on the next slide.
Andrew, can I go back to that slide?
Yeah.
That last slide.
Sorry. Yep.
There's one. June is a very dynamic month.
Yes.
So you can also plot this by shorter increments, by weeks. And what you'll see in June is, this, the beginning of June is more like
see that
May.
in the next slide. Yeah.
And the end of June is actually one of the highest used windows, those weeks at the end.
Right.
So you have to be a little careful when you see 15.7% of June. If you would do 2-week windows, your last 2 weeks of June.
That's what your graphic was, wasn't it?
It was by week.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just a little bit.
I mean,
higher.
that was very telling.
Right.
So yeah, so if you go to this next slide, you'll see I broke June and September up into 1st through the 15th in 2019 and 2020, and the 1st through the 15th for September of 2019, 2020. And as Brian said, 607 launches or use in the first 2 weeks, and then the second 2 weeks, 1,650. And then similar for 2020, and then September is a little less divided. There's not as much difference between the 1st and the 15th as there is the 16th and 30th. And so I broke it down by month into a few different categories, just in increasing amount of capturing the commercial use within a time frame. And you can see it going from 87 to 99% based on what months you select. So June 1st to September 30th, for all those years, 2008 to 20, 87% of the use. And 99% occurs April 1st to October 31st. Again, this is just commercial use. This has nothing to do with non-commercial use, but
Was there, So prior to 2016, the river was closed, or the upper river.
Just the upper, yeah.
Well, half of the upper.
Is it down to Lions? Was that where that?
Down to
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But, yeah, glossing over your numbers on the street chart, it didn't look like it was significant.
So looking at this thing and then looking at what Brian put out, it really looks like the peak season is June 15th to September 30th.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's what,
100%.
and I broke these numbers down again, sort of like this, and I added this last one because I realized I really didn't answer Commissioner Walsh's question in what would it look like for 2019 and 2020 if we broke it down in these periods. And so you can see what the percentage of use would be in the two shoulder seasons as proposed and the peak season as proposed. And 2020 is a little.
Proposed by who?
Well, I shouldn't say as proposed, but as the question was put to me, that shoulder season. 2020 is a little misleading because obviously people weren't here in the early season. So that 5%, yeah.
Is that where you have an asterisk?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And I would add on, keep in mind that this is commercially guided, guided anglers. If you look at resident use by month, you see a much bigger spring feed season, and there's May is the third highest month, April is, but when you go to non-resident, non-residents aren't quite willing to jump on airplanes in April, May.
What was that, the camera data?
No, this is from the angler surveys, reported by one May, so.
So what year was that, Brian?
I did them all for 2019.
Thank you.
That's the end of my slides. So I said short and sweet. So
That's great.
Very good job.
All right, thank you.
Andrew, thanks.
My pleasure.
Thanks for doing that.
We're going to be asking you for more information, I'm sure.
I'll try and deliver.
So, any other business for our group before we open this up to public comment? I think this data is really a great kind of introduction for the next meeting. We'll get into more detail of this stuff.
Well, I guess, Commissioner, if I could, what I'm taking away from this is we're blessed with a tremendous amount of high quality stock status information that's been accumulated over a number of years that we have we've got the ability to look at what this thing looked like historically, what it looks like currently, so we know what our stock status looks like. I'm not sure what to make exactly of all of the survey data, because it is somewhat conflicting with prior year stuff, but there it is anyway. I do like the fact that it was on-site survey this time and not just open-ended. And then this stuff here, I really appreciate you teasing out the number for 2019 and 20, because I know that had to have taken a lot of work. So that's the takeaway I'm getting. Is there something I'm missing? Is there another piece?
Not for tonight. I think that's what we got tonight.
Thank you.
All right then. So shall we open it up to public comment, Eileen?
It's up to you, Commissioner.
Yeah, okay. Does anyone in the, hi there.
I would like to say something. I'm Sandy Messenger. And thank you guys so much. I was at the September 8th meeting. I didn't have you. Yeah, I wasn't there on the 22nd. And I appreciate you taking your own time. And this is going to be a really tough. You've got a tough job ahead of you, and the public servants and the wonderful information that they've given us. And I really appreciate the fact that you listen to what they say and their recommendations. And this is what they do for a living, so I really appreciate that. But I heard something tonight that kind of disturbed me, and that on the big hole, and I'm just trying to get a feel. I was listening very carefully. The difference between the big hole and the Madison, that there was, what was it, a permit for 10 days went for $47,000. So that's what, $4,700 a day. So, huh?
Excuse me, big old beaver.
Big, what was it, Mike? Big hole or beaver head for
It was
47?
both.
What?
It was a combined.
So $4,700 a day. So my background is in loans. So if the market value in big hole is $4,700 a day, what is it on the Madison? Would it be comparable? Would it be about the same? So in 2023, we're gonna have guides that possibly, however you guys do the allocation, and I hope you ask your experts over here, because they probably thought about it a lot. You could possibly have a guide, or an outfitter, excuse me, that has $1,000 or 1,000 days on the Madison, that may just want to sell off 100 the next year, and you can make $470,000. 100 days times 4,700. So, and that's one heck of a return on investment, considering they didn't have to pay $1 for the allocation. Now, I have had an outfitter say, well, I've been paying the 3% a year, but as I think Eileen pointed out, September 8th, that doesn't even cover, the 3% doesn't even cover the maintenance on where you put in, put out. So just thinking about that, and I know I don't want to offend anybody, but it almost sounds, as a taxpayer, if someone can turn around and get handed permits, I understand they've been using it for quite a few years, 100 days, and can turn around and make $470,000 if that's what the market going rate is. You guys have a tough job in front of you, especially when there's outfitters that are new in the business that may not have fit into the 2020 criteria, and future outfitters that can't come in. I mean, because when you think about it, okay, $4,700 a day, how much do you, or how, would a bank lend money on that? How many years would it take to pay back that $4,700 earnings? 20 years? What do you, 10 years? What do you make? What do you make? How much money do you need? So that's what I'm just, that's a lot of money.
Well, thanks for the observation. I'd say we will definitely get into the economics of this before we're through with the process.
Right.
Everyone at the table's made a 3-year commitment. Before we make a recommendation to the commission, I am absolutely sure we will talk about what the estimated.
Yeah, it was like, I crunched numbers and I'm going, oh my gosh.
Right.
Plus anybody coming in new, a bank can't give them a loan like that, especially when we don't know climate change. I mean, it has to be cash. And it would have to be somebody with big money. And so people.
Could I ask her a question?
Yeah.
So, Sandy, is it the monetization of the permit that you have a problem with? Or is it the value of the permit that you have a problem with? If the permit was only, instead of, what did you say it was for?
$4,700 a day.
So if it was $25 a day, would you care?
Well, then it would be more affordable for outfitters, new outfitters.
So is that your point?
Yes.
Is that the
market value.
affordability for a new outfitter?
Yes.
So what you're saying, let me see if I summarize this. The first generation of outfitters receives a windfall, in your opinion.
Yes.
And the second generation of outfitter has to buy that and service a debt load that could cause them difficulty or no ability to enter the fishery. Is that
And
your,
would they even,
is that
would
your-
a bank
is that your
even
concern?
give them that debt with the risk?
but is that your concern?
Yes,
Is that what it was?
absolutely. Thank you. Nailed it.
Okay. Any other comments?
I think, so like leapfrogging off what she has to say, Seth and I bought our business 8 years ago. We both been guiding for 20 years. And we bought big whole beaver permits. We spent $400,000 on our permits. We just spent another $120,000 this last winter. So I think what we need to all realize is that the value of permits is going to be set by the market. And we're working on a resource So continuously adding on to these days is not good. So keeping the number at 19 and 20 is better. And if you're a bigger outfitter and you want to get more days, then buy more days. Right? I mean, that's, if you keep polluting the experience for the angler, then what's the point? I mean, at some point, then the natural resource has to matter.
Make a small comment on the big old beaver, there's a difference that 10 months of the year you can run unlimited trips.
I wouldn't call it 10 months.
You have
Frozen over.
Yeah,
Then-
two
Yeah.
months,
Yeah.
2 months.
Yeah.
Right?
Basically from November.
So if you buy, if you have access to a permit with 10 user days, there's actually a lot more trips than 10 trips, right? Because the outfitter can run.
There's actually 5, yeah, 35.
Yeah, it's 10 user days, 5 days, right?
It muddles the value of the per day. When, if someone has to sell 1,000 big hole days, they're probably not gonna.
They're not gonna get
400.
No, I know, cheaper by the dozen.
So one
Absolutely.
day is always gonna be more valuable because in an all or none system, because of the, and especially because of that shoulder season. So there's some things that muddle that day value when you look at what an individual permit is actually sold for.
Nancy?
Yeah, hi, I'm Nancy Delecta with Beartooth Fly Fishing, and I've been through this process for many years, and I'm thinking about one of the goals that had started off by the commission of this group, and that was that the decisions that come from this part of the Madison will then be used as a basis for other rivers and decisions on those rivers. I'm worried right now, and I want everyone to consider a thought process about the data. We are so blessed with the Madison's data elements that Fish and Wildlife has helped with the SRP process to keep in track. The Board of Outfitters has taken away the historic information that could continue to be available and accessed for all of the other rivers because there were logs that were required. And those were not being utilized and could have been in exist for many years. I mean, we were providing them forever. I don't know, and I want you to consider how you will deal with recommendations about the other rivers because you will not have data like we have for the Madison. You'll have to start from scratch. And such as the Missouri River, which if you ask the question about crowding, it is a busy river. There is no requirement of logging shuttles. There is no requirement of logging the historic use. I was at one access point that is a more remote one, and there were 16 trucks and trailers at a man-made launch ready to go. I mean, we need to think about the benchmark and how this group can help with those recommendations for gathering data. What data will we have to help those other rivers? The Yellowstone.
Well, Don's gonna be gone.
He'll probably
But
come back with a contract.
I do
Yes, surveyor.
suggest a revisit with the Board of Outfitters, even though over all these years, I know that the Board of Outfitters has had a different feeling about logs and format and information versus Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. But I do believe there's data that should be able to be shared, and people should consider how can that be readdressed and help this process.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I just wanted to say, also as a taxpayer, it kind of makes me, although I've had worked for the federal government for over 40 years, so I've seen, sometimes when I worked in contracting with DOD, I felt like I should just go out in the lobby and just start throwing out $1,000 bills. So I understand, you know, that the government's role is to stimulate the economy and get money out there. But, so, but that's a second concern of mine, that someone could flip it and have 100, days and then turn around and flip it the next year and potentially have a windfall.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I share a contrast to that for you to think about?
Sure.
The people who have invested 40 years into the
Nancy,
process.
can I stop you? I just feel like we gotta let these guys get on the road back.
Oh, okay.
And we'll just, you can say as long as you want.
Yeah.
Music is flowing.
Think about history and
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And
there's been more invested than you realize.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, good luck in your retirement.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let me connect with folks. Let me get it set up. I think the idea would be to go and say, right? I want to make sure.
Brian.